Well, hello there, and welcome to another reissue episode of The Infinite Inning. As always, I am Stephen Goldman, your convivial host for this not just a trip to the past, but a trip to our collective Infinite Inning past for a revisit of a long ago episode of the show that I hope still has some relevance and stories that I hope still have the power to entertain and edify. This week's reissue goes back to episode 67 of the show, so early in year 2. It begins with a story of Negro League's great and future Hall of Famer Josh Gibson, the power-hitting catcher, the only player, it seems like, now that we've been through 2025, who might have possessed the capability to have put up home run numbers in his own time comparable to those which Cal Raleigh totaled this year. Then I got into a discussion of the wins above replacement stat, and at the risk of repeating some talking points that I expressed then, I'm stimulated to get into it again now. I've talked before on this show about the wins above replacement stat and how it can be a useful framework for thinking about things outside of baseball, simply because it's a very simple concept at heart. It establishes a baseline, and it gives you the opportunity to measure the performance of players by how far they are from that baseline. Where the baseline is really up to you. The statistic sets it with a hypothetical replacement player, and the value of that player depends on the system. By hypothetical player, we mean a freely available AAA veteran type who you might turn to in desperation. The Marlins provided a pretty good example of that player this year in that everyone they tried at first base tended to, fail. And so eventually they kind of punted and turned to a 27-year-old former 13th round pick of the Yankees named Eric Wagaman. And Wagaman hit .250 with a .296 on base percentage and a .378 slugging percentage, which even in this year of low averages was not good. And maybe you could have tolerated it if he were a shortstop playing ridiculous defense, but he wasn't. He was a first baseman playing first baseman-ish defense, by which I mean not peak Keith Hernandez, who will always be the standard for me, he and Don Mattingly. And so if you wanted to judge the performance of every other first baseman in the league by his distance from Eric Wagaman, that would be a legitimate thing to do. There's a line that Mark Hamill has in Star Wars A New Hope. I think he says it to 3PO, who is expressing some confusion as to what planet he and R2-D2 have crash-landed on. And Hamill, as Luke Skywalker, replies, "You're on Tatooine. If you've ever heard of the bright shining center of the galaxy, Tatooine is the planet farthest from." There, he is doing a planets above replacement level riff. That's what I mean about how useful a wins above replacement framing can be in areas outside of baseball. Let me give you an example from my own life. I had a rough day this Monday, about 2 days ago now. A family member underwent a voluntary surgery. Voluntary in the sense that it was scheduled, not that it wasn't required. As with so many procedures of that nature, including one that I underwent back in August, it wasn't supposed to be too trying, not too debilitating. You'd go to sleep, they'd wake you up, you could spring right out of bed and get back to your life. And, well, for the person who underwent the procedure, that turned out to be completely inaccurate. Everyone is different. And so this person, this loved one, my wife and I were responsible for, had a very tough time of it for a while. And it was very difficult to watch, and it was stressful and exhausting. Worse, in the middle of that, I had a doctor's appointment of my own I couldn't miss, having rescheduled it once already for my own surgery. So I left our patient in charge of my wife and went to my second waiting room of the day, my second bout of forced HGTV, my second set of white coats, and so on. If you happen to be following me on Blue Sky on Monday, Stephen Goldman at bsky.social, you would have seen me say that the hardest part of going to the doctor is the HGTV. I've learned to tolerate needles. I've learned to tolerate having a shrimp fork stuck in my eye at regular intervals. But the constant flip or flop. I like the location, but not the Tuscan-style kitchen. And I want you to understand, I don't watch this stuff. I've picked up those words because it's force-fed into your mind via waiting room Ludovico technique. Listening to a stranger tell you about their kitchen preferences or the progress of their home reconstruction project is like being strapped into a dentist chair and having a stranger tell you about the content of their dreams or their fantasy team. When you think, well, I'm going to be in this waiting room for 90 freaking minutes or more, at least I can get some work done. But the room is only 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet, and they have the TV set at sufficient decibels to entertain a sold-out Madison Square Garden. And to compensate for that, every grandma in the room is watching her YouTube videos at a similar volume, sans headset. So how the hell am I, on deadline to figure out the grand unified field theory of physics, finally supposed to get that done in that kind of environment when I can no longer think clearly enough even to know to carry the two? We were finally going to get flying cars, folks, but not now, not after that, because some lady couldn't handle a Tuscan-style kitchen. What is a Tuscan-style kitchen? Does it have a sink? Does it have a stove? Does it have a fridge? Be at peace. God go with you. People are ridiculous. I have no doubt that back in the Neolithic, there was some family of cavemen fleeing an incoming blizzard or hurricane, and they climb into some hole in the rocks, and one member of the party said, I don't know, I'm not sure about this Tuscan-style cave. I think I'm going out there into the gale force 11 winds, okay? I must brave volleyball-sized chunks of hail because my backsplash isn't subway tile. So I go through this second appointment, and as I was driving back, I passed a bakery. We needed to get our patient to eat. They were resistant to doing so because they felt so ill. It was totally understandable. I've been there. It was also, though counterintuitive, what they needed to do to begin feeling better. So I thought I might bribe them with some kind of sweet. So I pull over, I go in, and as I'm standing at the counter, I start thinking, today has really sucked. I deserve a treat too, don't I? Now, normally I'm pretty good at resisting that kind of thinking, because I have to watch what I eat due to my own health issues, and the consequences are so bad that it becomes easier to say no. In the same way you might say no to crack cocaine if you've never tried it before, but you're aware of all the cautionary tales of where that slippery slope leads. Plus, if you've been listening to the show long enough, you know, because I've talked about this many times, that I've been fighting my weight basically my whole life. So when confronted with this sort of choice, if someone walks up to me and says, "Slice of cake, sir?" I attempt a saving throw. This is, as with wins above replacement, a metaphor for having resistance to the temptation. Now, I haven't played a tabletop role-playing game in 100 years, but I find the saving throw, that's where it comes from, to be a good metaphor for the process of resisting temptation. The ochre jelly is gushing at you with its sword. He attacks. Can a jelly be a he? I don't know. They attack, and you are about to be run through, but you try to make a saving throw. You dodge. And that's what I try to do. Thinking of it in those terms somehow makes it easier for me to say no to that sort of thing. Well, this time I didn't make the saving throw. I don't every time, obviously. If I did, I'd be as thin as a politician's promise. I don't think, though, I even attempted it. I just said, yes, give me. I need succor. S-U-C-C-O-R, you understand, not S-U-C-K-E-R. Well, earlier that day, I had been in a breakfast place, and they had a plate o' cinnamon rolls listed as one of their appetizers. Now, I am a sucker for a good cinnamon roll. Sucker, S-U-C-K-E-R, this time not S-U-C-C-O-R. I made my saving throw that time, in part because it seemed like a good dish for 4 people to share, but there were only 2 of us, and calorically going 50-50 was going to be really punishing. I also had my doubts, given the overall quality of the small chain that I was in, that said cinnamon rolls would actually meet that good qualifier, and so I successfully demurred. In the bakery, though, I looked past the cakes and cookies, and I saw it there on a shelf, the Grail, a cinnamon roll, glazed and not a plastic Dunkin Donuts factory manufactured coffee roll either, but the real deal, a bespoke cinnamon roll. And I said, this has been a miserable day, and I deserve a cinnamon roll. Listener, I bought it. I successfully resisted the urge to gobble it furtively in the car because that seemed unhealthy. I wasn't ashamed, so why act like it? No, I calmly got it back to where my wife and patient were waiting. I gave them what I had bought for them, and then came the moment, the big moment, the best part of the day, and you know what? It wasn't very good. I was so disappointed. It was just bland, with the flavor of lightly sweetened cardboard. How do I characterize how bad it was? How do I concretize for you what was a subjective experience? I'll do it like this. That cinnamon roll was 1.5 wins above Dunkin Donuts. And even that I'm not so sure about. But still, 0.5 WAD, or maybe SAD, sweets above Dunkin Donuts. If I could think of an acronym for war that spelled out, just don't, well, I would give it to you. But you get it now, right? There are 3 major versions of war: Baseball Reference, Baseball Prospectus, and Fangraphs. I tend to gravitate towards the Baseball Reference version because it covers all of history, and ours at Baseball Prospectus uses a formulation that requires information that doesn't exist for ye olden days. As you know from listening to this show, I spend a lot of time in ye olden days, and having access to the entire continuum of history matters very much to me. Outside of that, the differences don't matter to me that much, because broadly these statistics tend to agree. I find a fraction of a win to be insignificant since the stat is an approximation anyway, as are all defensive statistics, which feed into wins above replacement. Let's say in a given year, Aaron Judge has an 8 WAR season, and Bobby Witt Jr. has a 7.5 WAR season. I don't think that saying Judge was the better player based solely on one system's half-win differential is a very strong argument. In general, I don't like abdicating one's responsibility to think to some system or another. I find statistics like that, as I've been saying throughout this segment, very valuable for framing a discussion, but they should not be the end of a discussion. It's lazy. My grandfather used to have a quote from the British painter Sir Joshua Reynolds, framed above his desk. There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the real labor of thinking. He never discussed that quote with me specifically, but it was very consistent with his personal ethic, which he did discuss many times. I reserve the right to think, he would say. Sometimes he would add, if you want an incorrect answer, then I will reply quickly, or some variant on that. Essentially, compel me to speak before I'm ready to speak, and my response may not be accurate. I might reply before I've correctly weighed all the information. He was an engineer, so that kind of precision was important to him. I strongly agreed with that old man. It was the best thing he ever taught me. I reserve the right to think, and as with many rights, it's not only a right but an obligation. And that means you have to question everything, especially tradition, received wisdom, dogma, and ideology. The correct first response to each of those things is as follows. To received wisdom, you say, just because people have felt that way for a long time doesn't mean it's accurate. Tradition is similar. Just because things have been done that way for a long time doesn't mean that it's correct. Dogma is pretty easy, and so is ideology, because both insist you do according to what has been put forth by an authority figure who you are not supposed to argue with or disagree with, because circularly they are the authority figure and therefore they're always right. We may be talking about some ancient or current prophet who may have lived in the sky or the White House or both. It doesn't really matter which. They're increasingly the same thing. And if you don't believe in being bossed around by an invisible sky guy who claims divine right, literally or figuratively, then you're safe from that kind of intimidation. And well, if you do, I gave up arguing with folks like that about 25 years ago when I realized it wasn't getting me anywhere. Boring conversation anyway, as Han Solo once said. Last week, there was a very good essay by the sociologist and political economist William Davies at N+1, which was also published in abbreviated form at The Guardian. Both versions were free. It's called A Critique of Pure Stupidity, Understanding Trump 2.0. Mr. Davies runs through some definitions of stupidity in the political sense, including formulations by Immanuel Kant and Hannah Arendt, the latter of whom was responding to fascism. Davis writes, another way of expressing Kant's and Arendt's points would be that stupidity is an inability to compare like with like or to measure things. Instead, Stupidity merely mouths platitudes or obeys orders. But what are the social and political conditions that normalize this? One is a society where people wait for instruction on how to think, the condition of immaturity, as Kant saw it, or of totalitarianism for Arendt. And this is precisely what I mean when I talk about abdicating your responsibility to think critically, whether we're talking about the system or the ideology or the dogma or the man in the big tie or the big beard. And if you're into the man with the big beard, I would never try to take that away from you. I would only say that he gave you the faculty of reason for a reason, and he expects you to use it. The opposite would be perverse. At the risk of being gross, he also gave you the ability to urinate and the requirement to do it, but imagine if one of the commandments said, "Thou shalt not pee, thou wilt hold it forever." So we have the obligation to think, we have the ability to think, and we must use it, but we've been taught in a number of ways not to. And so we require frameworks to regiment our thinking, to organize it, and wins above replacement is one of them. Like I said, it's just a baseline. And it's as simple as, is this quantity larger than that quantity? This year, Aaron Judge gave me 6 apples. He is kind of tree-sized after all. But is that as many apples as is optimal? Is that as many apples as I want or need? In a few minutes, you'll hear me talking back in episode 67 about some discussion on television I saw involving, I think, Brian Kenny, who I would later guest with maybe 3 or 4 times. I don't think I had to that point. I'll mention a different show now, similar theme, one I don't recall, it was so long ago, who was involved. I just know that it was so early that it must have been the late 90s or circa the turn of the century, and they were talking about one player versus another, and one of the panelists said, well, war says, and some crotchety, gray-haired, old-time sports writer blew up and said, I do not accept that. It's not real. It's an imaginary stat. Dude, so much of math is imaginary. You know how long it took mankind to come up with the idea of 0? You can imagine 1 apple in your hand, but 0 was a huge leap for the primitive mind. It's not there. We need a quantity that describes not there, but it's not there. How is that a quantity? It just is. It has to be. And the idea of the replacement level and a player's performance relative to that baseline is actually very similar. The baseline is higher than 0, but you could set it to 0 and it would work out roughly the same way. The scale would just be higher. I felt both annoyed and sad at the time for that sports writer because his mind wasn't plastic enough to get there, somewhere that's actually pretty simple. As time went on, though, enough people did do the thinking and held off the chains that held them down, and war became an accepted stat. We see it more, I think, in pitching because win-loss records have decayed so much in the era of the 5-inning start and the opener and the bullpen. And maybe that kind of evolution can happen again when it comes to conceptualizing our wider world, but I'm not real sanguine about that. This reissue episode, as I said before, contains a discussion of Negro Leagues great Josh Gibson. Why was he a Negro Leagues great as opposed to an American or National League great? Due to tradition, received wisdom, dogma, and ideology. And that brings us full circle. That's all from me for this reissue episode. You may hear me patch over a break, or we might just skip right to the end, and you'll hear me then too. Thank you, as always, for listening to this reissue episode. I will now turn the rostrum over to my younger self. Please, be gentle with him. He's tender. Many years ago, walking through Boston, this was probably circa 2000, let's say, I was walking down Newbury Street, and if you've ever been there, you know it's kind of a touristy street. On a warm summer night, there are also a lot of locals, so it can be quite crowded. And traffic flow, which is not Boston's strong suit anywhere, is especially a problem there because the average block is about 3 feet long. So there's a traffic light every yard or so. Cars, by necessity, have to move slowly, but they're anxious. The drivers are anxious, not the cars themselves. This is not a Pixar film, are anxious to get out of that mess where they're going start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, and they're having tons of pedestrians flow in front of them on the rare occasions that they have a green light and can get clear. So it's a huge, fraught mess. And on this particular warm summer evening, I don't remember exactly. I was going to or from someplace and thinking maybe of the gourmet ice cream shop that was there then and is probably still there. And there was a wonderful used bookstore that, alas, is no longer there. It was called, I think, Rue Victor Hugo or something like that. And it had the traditional used bookstore cat. And actually, I believe the great short story writer Kelly Link worked there for a while, and for all I know, I picked up the odd book from her. But anyway, I was walking down the street, very much minding my own business, and there was a guy in a baseball cap on a bicycle weaving in and out of traffic, as those bicycle riders are wont to do in any city in this great land of ours. And I didn't quite see what happened. All I know is that a light changed. A car kind of jumped forward at the same time that the bike was crossing in front of him, and I don't think there was an actual car versus bicycle collision, but the cyclist did end up on the ground. Both the driver and the front seat passenger of that car got out immediately and rushed to the side of the cyclist, who was slowly pulling himself up to his feet. He didn't seem to be harmed, more like in a state of shock, and I thought they were going to his aid, that they would say things like, "Are you all right, bro? That was a wicked fall, bro." But no, they didn't. They started berating him for cutting them off on his bicycle in the most profane terms. And I thought, okay, this is familiar to me from countless scenes in New York City. And if you have spent any time as a pedestrian in New York, you have seen this. Someone steps into the crosswalk with the light, and a cab comes swinging around the corner, not paying the slightest attention to who's in the crosswalk, and nearly squishes the guy, at which point things tend to get rather heated between the pedestrian who just saw his life flash in front of his eyes and is not altogether happy about having had the experience, and the cab driver who, well, is 1,000% in the wrong, but has a living to make. But this experience was a little different because it varied from the New York version in this way. As they were yelling at the cyclist, he straightened himself up completely, and his baseball cap came into the light. And what was on that baseball cap? An interlocking Yankees NY. I saw it. The driver of the car saw it. His passenger saw it. And whereas they had been angry and upset before, now they were enraged. One of them said, "Oh, you're a Yankees fan?" And they actually started swinging at the guy. And my last memory of it, as a crowd closed in and I could no longer see what was happening, was that they were kicking the hell out of the guy. And I thought, yes, this is wholesome baseball fandom at its finest. So I need to chase those thoughts away, and I will tell you an extremely brief baseball story. You most likely have heard it before if you have spent any time at all with the players that I'm about to talk about. I don't mean in person, but in terms of reading or following the history of the game. If you haven't, it's kind of a classic baseball tall tale, and I kind of wish it was true, because just thinking about it makes me feel good. Josh Gibson was, as far as we can tell from this great distance, one of the best hitters ever to play baseball, a right-handed slugger who could hit 300 and literally knock balls over buildings. He is supposedly the only fellow to ever knock a fair ball out of the old Yankee Stadium, where it was approximately the distance from wherever you are sitting right now to Helena, Montana, to get the ball out. And that's just referring to the fences. To get it out of the physical building, the ball actually had to pause, take a deep breath, recollect itself, and launch again. And parenthetically, if you're listening from Helena, Montana, I've been there. Lovely town, beautiful state. And for all I know, Josh Gibson actually played there because during his lifetime, African Americans played everywhere that was not the white major leagues. During his lifetime is not quite accurate. That color line extended from the late 1880s until 1947 and then fell gradually, team by team, depending on how desperately they clung to their racism, through 1959. And even after that, the number of players of color you could use at one time was informally limited. As I'm saying these words, it occurs to me that we typically call that the color line or segregation. These are not necessarily instructive terms, and I wonder if it might be more vivid for people if we just called it affirmative action for mediocre white baseball players. How was it that Tommy Thibodeau had a 1,500 game career in the majors as a shortstop, but Pop Lloyd, who was referred to as the Black Wagner, had none? Well, because there was a spot reserved for Thibodeau. Simply put, there was a quota, and the quota was 100% white guys. Gibson was a catcher, and as I said, a great power hitter. His Hall of Fame plaque says he hit almost 800 home runs, but we really don't know what that means, as it includes all levels of competition, from Negro League regulation games to barnstorming trips to places like Helena, Montana, or the Mexican League, which briefly had aspirations of flourishing as a rival to the American major leagues. That's a story for another time, but the tragic aspect of it failing was that many African American players like Gibson, like Satchel Paige, had gone down there, and never mind the playing conditions or the level of competition or anything like that, but what they found was that they could play with dignity without anybody questioning them or putting them down on a racial basis. As an American, that's a very sad thing for me to have to report to you. Anyway, he was a very good power hitter. We just don't know exactly what that would have meant had he played with major league players. I don't think it's unrealistic to say he was one of the best hitting catchers ever and might have landed somewhere between Gary Carter and peak Mike Piazza. I mean, that's a very wide range, but it's impossible to know for sure. All we really know is he was deprived of the chance of showing us what he was capable of. And while that's often framed as his loss, it's really our loss. Gibson was born in 1911, and so by the time integration was even a realistic possibility, he was heading into his late 30s. He was already in decline too, not because his baseball skills had necessarily eroded a great deal, because by all accounts, bouncing between the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords, he was still playing quite well into the mid-40s. But he also had some other issues. He had some emotional maladies. He drank too much. He might have been on drugs. That's a controversial thing to say, and there's no real way to know. But we do know that somewhere around 1943, he had something that's characterized as a nervous breakdown. He was institutionalized for a week, 10 days. They'd let him out on a day pass to play baseball. And at that time, he may have been diagnosed with a brain tumor. And for reasons that, again, we can't really know, he decided to just let it go. And so, as the war years passed by and integration became a possibility, his skills did degrade, his comportment degraded, and add to that some understandable bitterness that Jackie Robinson did get to go ahead of him, and he wasn't in a place, either physically or emotionally, that he could have come up to the majors. In any case, he would never get the chance because in January 1947, this is just after Jackie Robinson had played a full season with Montreal, Gibson suffered a fatal stroke. But it's not the frustration and sadness that I choose to remember. It's a player who was so talented that he was capable of inspiring this story, which again did not happen, but is so wonderful to think about. The story goes that the Crawfords were playing in Pittsburgh, and it was the bottom of the ninth. Gibson was up, the pitcher dealt, the ball went sailing towards the outfield, and kept climbing, and climbing, and climbing, and it never did come down. The umpire signaled a home run, the Crawfords walk off, the game is over, everybody's happy. Flash forward about 24 hours, the same two teams are playing, except now they've moved on to Philadelphia. The locations in these stories vary, it doesn't really matter. But the two teams take the field, the Crawfords are once again at bat, when out of nowhere a ball comes sailing down from a great height in the sky. The outfielder settles beneath it and makes the catch. And the umpire, as if this kind of thing happened every day, pointed to Josh Gibson and said, "You're out. Yesterday. In Pittsburgh." I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is The Infinite Inning. Well, hello there. Gonna get right into it today because I'm kind of exercised. I made the mistake of listening to a call-in radio show on Sirius XM's MLB network radio, which I greatly enjoy listening to, had a program on as part of the Baseball Prospectus renting the channel for a few years back when I was part of that outfit. It wasn't just me, it was me and Kevin Goldstein and Mike Farron, and we had a great time for a couple of years until I broke up the band. Well, wait, hang on, pause a second before I get into that. Back to what I was saying about this call-in show. They were debating the National League MVP race. And I guess this is a complicated issue because there's not a slam dunk candidate for the award among the position players. The leading players in the National League in terms of wins above replacement, and I'm talking about the Baseball Reference version now, are all pitchers. Max Scherzer has 7.2, Jacob deGrom has 7.1, Aaron Nola has 6.8, and you have to go down a bit until you get to the first position players, which, as of Friday's games, was a tie between Lorenzo Cain and Matt Carpenter at 5.2 each. At the time that I tuned in the middle of the discussion, they weren't batting about whether a pitcher should win the award or not. And when I say they, I'm not trying to be cute or anything. I didn't catch who the announcers were, given that I joined the program already in progress, and SiriusXM moves their hosts around quite a bit with one pinch hitting for the other. And normally it doesn't make a big difference, but in this case, it wasn't anybody who I immediately recognized. So I'm afraid I have to go with the non-specific pronoun they. So they weren't talking about whether you could just give it to Scherzer and say forget the position players for this year, or deGrom, who for all intents and purposes is tied with him, but things like whether you can hold Matt Carpenter's April against him, because you'll recall that as great as Matt Carpenter has been, he was kind of 0 for April. Now that Matt Carpenter's career is over, it seems sort of odd to talk about him as a potential MVP candidate, and yet he had 2 top 10 MVP award finishes, including 4th place in 2013. Please forgive a quick break here, and on the other side, the phone call that so set me off back in the yesterdays. In the midst of this, a fellow called in, and he said I would like to posit a hypothetical. And the hypothetical is that he wanted to pretend, first, that Brian Kenny was a mute, and that second of all, the WAR statistic had never been invented, and that the MVP candidate should be considered in light only of the information that you would have if wins above replacement did not exist, and that therefore Lorenzo Cain, who has 8 home runs and 30-something RBIs, would be outright disqualified. Nobody would say anything as ludicrous as Lorenzo Cain winning an MVP award. And the hosts entertained this possibility. And I was extremely disappointed with that because
to my mind, that caller was everything that is wrong with our world today, with specifically America today. And I promise you for this one time, I'm not going to make a big political analogy out of this, but what exactly is the benefit of saying, let's pretend we don't know what we know and then make a decision on that basis? There are a couple of purposes behind war. For one thing, you can compare all players to a baseline. And that concept, comparing a player to a baseline, works throughout time. So you can understand how far above his leagues Babe Ruth was in a given year and how far above his league Mike Trout is in a given year. And you can have an understanding that is something like, and I'm not going to look this up, but to utilize a player I mentioned earlier in the show, you can say Babe Ruth is to Tommy Thibodeau as Mike Trout is to Chris Davis. That's one. It's very simple. And then the second aspect of it is to be able to take the sum total of a player's contributions, hitting, base running, fielding, and lump them all together into one value so that you can have a sense of the totality of the player. Also kind of basic. And I've seen, for people who are not hip to this, the idea of replacement level, that the replacement level player being a hypothetical really just blows their train of thought straight off the tracks. They can't conceptualize that for some reason. And to them we could say, well, we could do wins above average, which we do. We have it. It's just not as good a number because major league players are so good and the average player is so unusual that you're really not giving the good guys enough credit for what it is that they're able to achieve over the kind of player who would sub for them if they, say, as Mike Trout just did, injured a wrist and had to go on the DL. It's a long fall from there, and the fall is well past average. But, if you can't comprehend the idea of a hypothetical fringe player, then fine. We can do average. It's really whatever makes you happy. As long as you understand you have a baseline and we're comparing you to the baseline. Just about everything we do in this world works this way. We can't understand how to value something in isolation. We only know how to value it in relation to other things. Say that, pursuing the same fantastic amnesia that our call-in show caller wanted us to pursue, we pretend that we don't know the scale on which money operates. So I say to you, I have a diamond and it's worth $10,000. Well, is that a lot? Is it a little? I won't know until you tell me that you just went to Taco Bell, and I do pray for your soul, and got something like 6 mystery meat tacos for $1.50. Well, then I'll get a sense that my diamond is worth a lot of mystery meat, but I wouldn't have known to that point. For like the 4th time in this last 15 minutes, I will say again that these concepts are not complicated. I last took math in the 11th grade, and I promise you I was not paying attention. And yet, these concepts are less about math, for the end user anyway. For the person who's putting the stats together, they sure are a heck of a lot about math. But for you and I, at the end of it, if we are willing to trust that the elements that go into it are weighted correctly, and as long as the system is internally consistent with itself, I don't have a reason to think that they are not weighted correctly, then it's just a handy tool for putting a whole bunch of players who do a lot of different things in many different contexts and sticking them on the same continuum. The bigger problem here, and this is why I say that call symbolized almost everything wrong with our society today, is that if the knowledge that we have acquired tells you something that disturbs you in some way, that you don't like, that you don't want to know, you can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. You can instruct a couple of pliant talk show hosts to go along with your little hypothetical, but it doesn't do anything to add to the truth of your argument. If anything, it subtracts from it. You can't say you don't know how to assemble Lorenzo Cain's complete performance or any player's complete performance and then say you don't like what it shows you about that player's performance or how it relates to all players any more than I can say, hey, Brad, let's take your mother up on the roof of this tall building and pretend the law of gravity doesn't exist. What do you say? Since you're anti-law of gravity or anti-global warming or anti-cats or whatever the hell you want to pretend doesn't exist because it's inconvenient for you, you might want to go along with me for a few minutes. But to borrow from Randy Newman, as soon as we give Mom a good shove, she will go sailing no more. And then what do you have? You have street pizza where you used to have a mother. And I'm not trying to beat this analogy totally to death or totally into the street. And I'm also not saying that Lorenzo Cain should be the National League most valuable player. I don't know who that should be. I don't have a strongly formed opinion on that. I still have an open mind, and there's enough season left for me to take my time in figuring it out. Not that I have a vote, having long ago turned in my BBWAA card. The point is, in my lifetime, I have seen players like Ozzie Smith and Alan Trammell lose MVP awards to guys like George Bell, or Derek Jeter lose a couple to Juan freaking Gonzalez and Justin Morneau because the shape of their contribution on the season did not match aesthetically to someone else's preconceived notion of what an MVP award winner looked like, which largely consisted of a bunch of home runs and a bunch of RBIs. For most of the history of that award, nothing correlates to an MVP award win like piling up a whole bunch of RBIs. And RBIs, I'm sorry, are just a context-based creation. They're not a bad thing to have a lot of, I'm not saying that, but you can't drive in base runners who aren't there. For that matter, I saw Don Mattingly win the 1985 MVP award over Rickey Henderson, and Mattingly was great that season, and I loved him, don't get me wrong. But, and again, I'm just doing the stats off the top of my head, so I'm going to be off by one or two here. But if you boil it down, essentially Rickey Henderson scored 145 runs, and Don Mattingly spent half the season batting behind him in the number 2 hole, and he drove in 145 runs. And no, it wasn't an exact 1-to-1 ratio, but I am not exactly clear why Rickey Henderson getting on base often enough for Mattingly to drive him in was a vastly inferior act to Mattingly driving him in. We know better now, and I am sorry if it displeases you that Lorenzo Cain does a whole lot of different things well on the baseball field and hasn't put together a baseball card where the back looks like Juan Gonzalez's baseball card. Why can you not accept that just because he has not put up big numbers in 2 categories, home runs and RBIs, that he might not be doing something just as valuable in all those other categories? You have a very limited imagination, and you cannot conceive of a world that does not conform to your received wisdom of the way it's shaped. And so you are folding your arms, holding your breath, stamping your feet, and saying, no, 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 no. There are no rules about this, you know. In 1944, Marty Marion, who was the shortstop for the St. Louis Cardinals, won the National League MVP award. And he hit .267 and slugged .362. He had 6 home runs, and he drove in 63 runs on the season and scored 50. And I am not saying that he was necessarily the best choice for an MVP award that year, not in a league with Stan Musial in it. But if the voters decided that his glove work was good enough, and it certainly seems as if it was, that he was extraordinarily valuable to his team that year, I don't see how that's any less legitimate a criterion for giving out an award than any other damn thing you might think of. I've read my Bible, and there's no chapter in Genesis or anywhere else where some great voice from on high says,
"The MVP award winner must have more than 8 home runs and 30 RBIs."
It's just what someone wants. And that's why I hear a call like that, and then I flip over 2 channels and listen to the regular news and hear that California's on fire and the rest of the world is too. And I say, well, why can't people accept global warming? It's not that they're resisting it. It's not that they really believe it's a Chinese hoax or whatever they're being told by the politicians. It's just that they say, let's pretend that I don't know the things that I do know, and we'll go forward on that basis. And you can get away with that for a while, until all about you is ash, and the leaves on every tree lie curled and blackened at your feet. Yes, folks, it's Armageddon just because somebody didn't want Lorenzo Cain to be an MVP. I've made a mountain out of a molehill as usual. By Aunt Petunia's polydactyl piano-playing pussycat, we have come to the end of another
Here
episode.
is where, in the olden days, I used to tell you how to follow the guest on social media, but that social media is now verboten off limits in a downward spiral, and if it's not, I don't care to hear information to the contrary. That is one place in which I will contradict everything I said to you about thinking earlier. For now, suffice it to say that, as I remarked earlier in the episode, you can follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social.
Which I mean me at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, knock, I will let you in. I haven't said no to anybody yet. You can bring a friend. Bring a positively vociferous friend, by which I mean not that he's very vociferous, but that he's vociferous in a positive way. And, of course, if you have a spare moment, please drop by Apple iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. Every single one of those steps helps more people find the show and helps this hardened criminal find a measure of redemption in a cold world that has turned its back on him. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by the number 22. Our producer is Monty, the bear who loved board games. Our theme song, The Infinite Man, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who reminds you that you're not quite as quick as you think you are.
Well, that's it from the Infinite Inning gang for another reissue episode. I'll be back this weekend with a brand new episode, number 348, I believe. Enjoy all the playoff baseball between now and then, okay?